today, for whatever reason, some countries feel cannot be extrapolated. So I would urge you really to look on the fact that substantively on the key development issues of debt, issues of finance, issues of food, issues of fuel, issues of health, issues of climate. In fact, this meeting was able to get everybody around the table. And as I said, this is no easy task given the state of polarization in the world. On your question about global skills mapping. Essentially today, there is a growing demand in the developed world for skills and talents. There is a growing availability, but they are not necessarily in the developed world. Much of that availability is in the developing world. So how do you match the demand and supply for the benefit of the global economy? That is the really crucial issue. For a country like India, which has significant human resources, and which fortunately now has a government which pays attention to the development of those human resources, which actually focuses on skills and talent and innovation and education, this is an opportunity for us. So especially in the last 9 years, we have also been looking at what are called mobility and migration partnership, which allow for legal mobility, which ensure that talent and skills which go out get the same treatment in those particular geographies as their own citizens. And which ensure that all of this is legal and free of any illegal activities. Now, it's not just India. I'm citing India because we are among the countries where, very active in this. But there are other countries as well. So this is widely recognized. In fact, in today's intervention, I'm not, I think the etiquette is that you don't specifically say what, individual ministers said. But I can tell you that some of the relevant international organizations and some of the other ministers there spoke at some length about the importance of how do you ensure, smooth mobility, how do you ensure protected mobility, legal mobility, because this is today one of the big issues before the international economy. On the Taiwan Straits issue, I think the answer is very simple. No, the matter was not discussed today. जो आपका जो सवाल है कि बाली में हम लोग जो हैं उस समय माने हमारे कारण ही नहीं, हम सब मिलके हमारा योगदान तो था जरूर उसमें कि हम लोग उस समय वहाँ सहमति बना पाए. अब क्या हुआ है कि बाली के बाद अभी जो है दुनिया में काफ़ी कुछ घटनाएं हुई हैं. अब जो G20 के सदस्य जो हैं जो इस मुद्दे के साथ जो जुड़े हुए हैं उनके इस मामले में अलग अलग विचार हैं और हम जो हैं इस बार उनके विचार माने उनके बीच में इतना गैप था कि हम लोगों ने प्रयास तो की पर प्रयास के बावजूद हम जो है इस समय सहमति बना नहीं पाए. तो आप देखेंगे कि जैसे हमने बेंगलोर में किया था वैसे ही जो बाली में जो तय हुआ है उसी को हमने दोहराया है और हमारी जो सोच है कि G20 के ज़्यादा सदस्य जो हैं वो अभी भी बाली के जो आउटकम जो था उसके साथ वो जुड़े हुए हैं. So essentially he asked me saying that why were you not able to carry forward what happened in Bali, and I explained that given the state of polarization, given presumably developments which have happened since then, we found that positions were very far apart and we tried very hard. We were not the only country who tried. The G20 works very, very collectively, but we were not able to bridge the gap. But I want to conclude by highlighting one very important point. In the past, for quite a few years now, G20 foreign ministers have met. This is the first time that the G20 foreign ministers have produced an outcome document. The outcome document, I think, reflects consensus and cooperation and collaboration on a very vast number of issues that are particularly important today for the international community, for the global south. So very frankly, I think it's a good day's work that we have done, and I'm very happy to share it with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you also, Foreign Secretary, sir, and Susherpa Abhay. Thank you all for joining us today. Good evening.
Okay, that was Dr. S. Jaishankar taking a small group of questions centered around, the possibility of a joint consensus at the G20, which remains elusive right now, and also throwing light on that all-important bilateral meeting between himself and his Chinese counterpart that's just taken place a short while ago. The big focus in that meeting between the Indian and Chinese foreign ministers was, of course, on the border issue, peace and tranquility issues, the first bilateral since the Ladakh standoff began over 3 years ago. So the India-China standoff was the topic of discussion. Dr. S. Jaishankar has also said that the Ukraine issue has become a very, very polarizing issue and it has hampered the possibility of consensus at the G20. He didn't say it, of course, in so many words, but that was the sense that the Indian External Affairs Minister was giving at this point of time. So the G20 moving into top gear. This evening, we will see more statements coming out. That suspense remains over what kind of consensus, if any, will have been involved in the G20. Remember, today is only day 1. Tomorrow is day 2. India stands as not only as the host of the G20, but in many ways is being seen as a potential calming influence for what is essentially a very, very broken and stricken and damaged world. You've got the two big, the big ticket spectacle, moments from today's G20 meetings. You've got there Dr. S. Jaishankar meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States. Two countries that have been, embroiled in an increasingly aggressive Cold War that's come to a flashpoint now in the battlefield of Ukraine. I want to go across to India today's Gaurav Sawant, who joins me live now. Gaurav, you heard what Dr. S. Jaishankar was saying just now. What stood out for you from what he was saying, Gaurav? That consensus, a joint communique at the G20, is that likely? Is work being done towards it? What's the sense that you got from the External Affairs Minister?
So the situation remains extremely grim, considering the fact that there are countries that are moving back from the position that they had reached, the consensus that reached in Bali. And that was where India had played a key role in arriving at the consensus that this is not an era of war. But countries like, perhaps, as was the case in the finance ministers' meet, China and Russia moving back even from that position when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. India trying its best to ensure that all issues are given equal treatment, especially the issues that are raised by the global south or developing countries. India has been pushing for the sustainable development goals to be considered, reliability of supply chains, energy security, food security, security of movement, all of that extremely critical as far as developing economies are concerned. Climate goals, again, the West imposing undue costs on the developing countries, and we're seeing the impact of that. Now, these are some of the issues that India has been highlighting as a leader of the global south and using India's presidency of G20 to bring global focus on these issues. But some of the Western countries or the developed countries remain very focused on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Again, look at the ground realities, Shiv. That's not a war of India's making or global South's making, and yet there are costs that are being imposed, whether it's food prices or energy prices or supply chains, that the global South bears the cost of something that's being done by the global North at a time where India's making very clear there's only one way, which is peace, dialogue and negotiations.
Gaurav, what about the, he answered very briefly that, about the bilateral with the Chinese foreign minister. What did you pick up from that? He pretty much said what he tweeted as well, which is that the discussion centered around, the bilateral challenges, especially peace and tranquility in the border areas. Was there any indication from what he said, that there has been any kind of forward movement?
Well, there's a very firm stand that India has taken, and there's a reiteration of that stand. And that stand is, for the relationship to move forward, peace and tranquility at the borders is essential. That's the basic. And if you notice, from 2020 to 2023, India's stance has remained the same. For this relationship to move forward, China will have to restore the April-May 2020 situation. Now, we're still waiting for a readout of the Chinese side. Perhaps that'll come today, later tomorrow, maybe what the Chinese foreign ministry says, and we'll have a little more idea of what the Chinese thinking is. But there is no dilution of India's stand. Remember, Shiv, you and I have talked about this before. You and I have covered this on Ground Zero. It's the largest standoff between the armies of India and China that's on from April-May 2020 till now, and neither side willing to back down.
Okay, neither side willing to back down. Let's just quickly summarize for you what the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has just said. He said that an attempt was made to evolve consensus, but that hasn't happened at the G20 so far. Attempts are still, of course, being made. Today is day one. Tomorrow is day two of the foreign ministers meet. But let me just read out exactly what our sources have told us pertaining to this particular story. It says we spent about 45 minutes talking to each other. He's talking about his meeting with the foreign minister of China. He also says that the Ukraine conflict has been the main reason for no joint consensus or communique as part of the G20 foreign ministers meet so far. Take a look at the crucial soundbite from what the foreign minister just said.
I met Minister Chingang on the sidelines of the conference this afternoon. It's our first meeting after he took over as foreign minister. So we spent, I don't know, maybe about 45 minutes talking to each other. There are real problems in that relationship that need to be looked at, that need to be discussed very openly and candidly between us. That's what we sought to do today. We also had a brief discussion on what is happening in the G20 framework, but the thrust of the meeting was really on our bilateral relationship and the challenges in the bilateral relationship, especially that of peace and tranquility in the border areas.
Okay, Gaurav continues to be with me. Gaurav, Dr. Jaishankar saying very clearly in no, ambiguous terms that it is the Ukraine war that has, been mainly responsible for the lack of any kind of consensus in the G20 foreign ministers meet so far. Today is day one, tomorrow is day two, Gaurav. Are we to understand that, the delegations, the teams are still trying to work something out? Because Lavrov came out all guns blazing today against the Western delegations.
Oh, he absolutely did. In fact, he hit out at some of the Western, leaders, given that some of them, according to him, boycotted or stayed away from the dinner. Some of them behaved, as he said, in a very difficult manner. But India's effort has been to bring Russia and America, at least on the talking table, on the dialogue table. And the External Affairs Minister responded to a question. There was some speculation that the Russian Foreign Minister and the American Secretary of State would be meeting separately away from cameras. He did respond that, well, there was some movement, but not in as many words. So India's been trying. Have we been successful as a nation? Maybe not completely at this stage, but the effort continues. Then again, Shiv, India's point is that one issue of Russia-Ukraine conflict or something that Europe and America are focused on should not derail G20 that talks about not just what's happening in the developed world, but the developing economies. It's the voice of the global south that must be heard, the issues that the developing economies face, whether it's food security or energy security, rising prices, climate challenges, all of these are issues that must be addressed, and they're equally important and cannot be held hostage to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And that's the point India has been repeatedly making. Unfortunately, European countries and America remain focused on trying to ostracize Russia or have other countries call out Russia for the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Shiv.
Gaurav, stay with me, because the Russia-Ukraine war, which Gaurav has covered, he was the first Indian journalist there last year once the invasion began, it remains, this whole year later, the biggest elephant in the room. It's the biggest world issue, and it's also the biggest elephant in the room at this ongoing G20 foreign ministers meet in India's national capital. External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar held that bilateral with Sergei Lavrov earlier today. The Russian foreign minister, also well known as one of Russian President Vladimir Putin's right-hand men, was here, and he, like I said, began his public engagements by attacking all of the Western delegations and basically saying that they've been blackmailing other economies. In his briefing, Lavrov not only lauded India and Prime Minister Modi's role in governance as the Ukraine war shadow loomed across the globe, but continuing his tirade against the Western nations, Lavrov claimed that it was the West, especially the United States and the UK, that had derailed peace talks between Russia and Ukraine and had been amping up pressure to isolate Russia from the rest of the world. External Affairs Minister Jaishankar also addressed the global impact of the war that has been raging for over 12 months now. Jaishankar stated that while the G20 focused on strengthening multilateralism, the war's impact has largely affected the global south. And he very tellingly said it is this war that has meant no joint communique, no joint consensus has been involved at the G20 so far.
Is the conflict impacting the global south? Of course it is. I mean, it's not something new. In fact, India has been saying this very strongly for pretty much close to a year, that, this is affecting, in fact, today in my own session, I actually used the word saying for much of the global south, this is a make or break issue, that the cost of fuel, the cost of food, the cost of fertilizer, the availability of fertilizer, which means next year's food, these are all extremely pressing issues. And if you see some of the countries who were already struggling with debt, who were already impacted by the pandemic, for them, this conflict, the knock-on effects of this conflict coming on top of that has been really, damaging is a very, very mild word. On one particular issue, because of very polarized views of some countries, we were not able to bridge it on this particular occasion. Whereas, as our colleague pointed out from there, we were able to do that, a number of us were able to do that collectively in Bali. But obviously, the Bali situation today, for whatever reason, some countries feel cannot be extrapolated. In fact, this meeting was able to get everybody around the table. And as I said, this is no easy task given the state of polarization in the world.
Today, when addressing the participants of the foreign minister meeting, President Modi, I think he presented balanced and responsible position of the country as the president of the G20. And in this address, he was not just speaking about some isolated individual situations, because the West is trying to divide the geopolitical picture into individual episodes. But in the address by Mr. Modi, he gave the assessment of the situation across the globe.
Оценка общего состояния дел в мире. Напомню в очередной раз.
When we are called to start negotiations, I do not remember anyone from the Western colleagues, anyone else from any other countries, talk to Ukraine to call upon them to start negotiations, because Ukraine is encouraged to continue war. When Ukraine was ready to be engaged in negotiations last March, Ukraine was slapped on their wrists. Everyone knows this, the United States, the United Kingdom, and from what I understand, they told the Kiev regime, if Russians are ready to sign an agreement on resolving the situation, it means that we need to drag it out, that we need to make them weaker to achieve the victory on the battlefield, to defeat them on the battlefield, to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia.
Стратегического поражения России.
Let's bring Gaurav back in on this. Gaurav, what does this say about what's going to happen next between Russia and Ukraine? Because you've got Lavrov pretty much pointing a direct finger at the US and UK and saying that any possibility of normalization of peace talks between Russia and Ukraine have been hampered deliberately by the UK and the United States.
Shiv, this has been Russia's case all throughout, that Russia is actually fighting the United States and NATO. Ukraine is just a tool in between. Peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, they couldn't move forward because America and the UK didn't want it, according to Sergei Lavrov. So that's one part of the story. The second part is that even President Putin pointed out how Europe and America continue to arm Ukraine, and that's actually prolonging the war, that's prolonging the pain that people are facing. The global effort should be to bring about a consensus, negotiated settlement, dialogue, and that is not happening.
Yeah.
The war is actually being encouraged with more weapons being supplied to Ukraine. That's, of course, Russia's point of view. India's point of view constantly has been that India can play a role, but a settlement can only be found through dialogue. Hostilities need to stop. Dialogue is the way forward, and that is where the world needs to come together. But as External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar clearly pointed out, that the stance taken by the opposing sides are so diverse that it wasn't possible to bridge that gap today.
Gaurav, stay with me. Let's listen into what Prime Minister Modi said in his address earlier today to the G20 foreign ministers. Remember, this is how the summit today began. It's been a very dramatic day. Many things have been said. But here's what the Prime Minister said right at the start.
They are also the ones most affected by global warming caused by richer countries. This is why India's G20 presidency has tried to give a voice to the global south. No group can claim global leadership without listening to those most affected by its decisions. Excellencies, you are meeting at a time of deep global divisions. As Foreign Minister, it is but natural that your discussions are affected by the geopolitical tensions of the day. We all have our positions and our perspectives on how this tension should be resolved. We must also admit that the tragic consequences of this failure are being faced most of all by the developing countries. After years of progress, we are at risk today of moving back on the sustainable development goals. Many developing countries are struggling with unsustainable debt while trying to ensure food and energy security for their people. We have seen stable economies suddenly overwhelmed by debt and financial crisis. These experiences clearly show the need for resilience in our societies, in our economies, in our healthcare systems, and in our infrastructure. The G20 has a critical role to play in finding the right balance between growth and efficiency on one hand and resilience on the other. We can reach this balance more easily by working together. That is why your meeting is important. I have full trust in your collective wisdom and ability. I am sure that today's meeting will be ambitious, inclusive, action-oriented, and will rise above differences. Excellencies, we must all acknowledge that multilateralism is in crisis today. The architecture of global governance created after the Second World War was to serve two functions. First, to prevent future wars by balancing competing interests. Second, to foster international cooperation on issues of common interests. The experience of the last few years, financial crisis, climate change, pandemic, terrorism, and wars, clearly shows that global governance has failed. At the leading economies of the world, we also have a responsibility toward those who are not in this room. The world looks upon the G20 to ease the challenges of growth, development, economic resilience, disaster resilience, financial stability, transnational crime, corruption, terrorism, and food and energy security. In all these areas, the G20 has capacity to build consensus and deliver concrete results. India has selected the theme of One Earth, One Family, One Future for its G20 presidency. It signals the need for unity of purpose and unity of action. I hope that your meeting today will reflect the spirit of coming together for achieving common and concrete objectives.
Let's go across to India today's Akshay Dongre for more. Akshay, what does the rest of the day look like as far as the G20 is concerned? These very big bilaterals have just taken place. What next?
Well, Shiv, as far as the rest of the day is concerned, there is going to be a press conference by the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken.
Yeah.
So we have seen fireworks now coming from Sergei Lavrov, who accused the UK, the US, the entire West of sabotaging the outcomes of the G20, of how India would have expected it to be as far as the foreign ministers meet is concerned. In fact, Sergei Lavrov also apologized, according to our colleague Geeta Mohan, who has been reporting all day on this, that Sergei Lavrov also apologized on behalf of the West, that this is not how the entire event should have been, how the outcome should have been. So now we can expect a fire back from Antony Blinken as far as the allegation by Russia is concerned. Yes, there were very important bilaterals. As far as the joint commune, however, is concerned, the country could not be brought to a consensus. Dr. S. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, had just held a briefing right here where I'm standing right now. He also said that we tried really hard, and it's not just India that tried really hard. There are a lot of countries who tried to persuade, to bridge the gap between the West and Russia and China, but there could not be a consensus. In fact, the document of the G20 has come, the consensus document has come, and there is a footnote there that all countries agree to the joint document except para 3 and 4, which is not acceptable by China and Russia. This is similar to what happened in Bengaluru, where during the finance ministers meet, a similar kind of thing happened when the G20 members tried to replicate the Bali Declaration, the para 3 and 4, which mentions war, which mentions Ukraine, which mentions aggression. They could not be accepted by China and Russia. Situations have changed, yes. On ground in Ukraine, there is a lot of pressure on Russia as far as the conflict is concerned.
Stay with me, Akshay. Let me just come back to you in just a moment. This, another big sort of Kodak moment at the G20, has been the meeting between the Prime Minister and the Italian Prime Minister as well. Many important images from the G20 have come to the fore. Some of those images have gone viral.